Will, did you have an opportunity to review this?
I have not yet.
It appears to be fine based upon my ruling, but I'll let you look at it, maybe let me know if there's any issues with the comments that weren't appropriate happening in the.
Okay.
May we bring the jury in?
Yes.
It's a few minutes early, but I'm hoping they're back.
May be seated.
Everyone else may be seated. State may call its next witness. And for the jury's information, Ms. Murphy was previously sworn and instructed on the rule of sequestration, so she may approach the witness stand.
Witness is seated.
May I inquire, Ms. Schwartz?
Thank you, Judge. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
Can you tell us your name, please?
Yes, my name is Allison, Allison, Murtha, Murtha.
And what do you do for a living, Miss Martha?
I am the manager and a forensic scientist in the forensic science department in a private laboratory which is very near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, called R.J. Lee. That's R.J.L.E.E. Group.
What does R.J. Lee Group do?
R.J. Lee Group is really a materials analysis company. There's several different departments in the company, each having its own specialty. There are departments in chemistry, both organic and inorganic. We have a litigation department, a concrete department, materials and environmental department, and we also have a small forensics department which analyzes trace evidence, specifically gunshot residue.
And that small department is where you work.
Yes, sir.
Sometime between October 29th, 2011, and the date that you're sitting here today, were you called upon to examine a gunshot residue kit for Brian Lemmer?
Yes, sir, I was.
And I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit LL, asking if you recognize this item by powder packaging, any seals, signatures that belong to you.
Yes, I do recognize it.
Okay. And do you recognize that to be the kit that we're talking about for Brian Lemmer?
This is the package that contained the kit that we're speaking about. It is sealed with my initials and the date.
Okay. And it doesn't appear that the seals have been broken.
No, sir, it does not.
And it's in substantially the same condition as the last time you saw it.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Tell us, please, Ms. Murphy, what gunshot residue is.
Gunshot residue, or as I will often refer to it as GSR, is basically the stuff that comes out of a firearm whenever it's discharged. Specifically, whenever I am talking about gunshot residue, I am talking about the primer portion of the particulate. So, for example, let's talk about where that comes from. Typically, the item that is put into a firearm in order for it to be discharged is called a cartridge. And typically at the bottom of that cartridge, it looks like a bullseye, like a target, okay, especially when we're talking about center fire ammunition. In the center of that target, the center of that bullseye, it's what is referred to as the primer cap. Within that primer cap, there's something called the primer mixture or the primer paste. That mixture contains three very important elements. Those elements are lead, antimony, and barium. Now what happens is when the trigger is pulled, something called the firing pin is going to tap the back of that cartridge, and that's going to cause a reaction. It's going to cause a spark. That is then going to ignite that primer mixture or that primer paste. That mixture then ignites something called gunpowder, and you get this buildup of heat and pressure inside that cartridge. And that buildup of heat and pressure is so intense and so immense that it pushes the bullet forward and out of the firearm. At the same time that happens, those elements of lead and antimony and barium from the primer are going to come out of the firearm. They're going to come out of the firearm in any potential opening that the firearm has. Any crack, any crevice, any opening in the firearm is a possible escape route for those particles.
How big are the particles as they escape from the firearm?
The particles are very, very small. To give you an idea of how small they are, they can't be seen with the naked eye. If I were to take one piece of my hair, okay, if I were to take one piece of my hair and hold it out like this, the length of the hair, and turn it on its end, so you can see the end of one piece of my hair, I could fit 30 to 50 gunshot residue particles across the length of the diameter of one piece of hair.
So we're talking microscopic.
Microscopic. If you put two football fields end to end, it would be like looking for a pea on two football fields.
Tell us what composition of antimony, barium, and lead you have to have in order to be gunshot residue.
Basically what happens is after that firearm is discharged, you get this plume surrounding the firearm. That's where the lead and the antimony and the barium are. Now what happens is those elements, as the temperature cools, they're going to condense together and they're going to form one particle that contain all three of those elements. So one particle that contains lead and antimony and barium. Those are the particles that I'm looking for. Those are the particles that are extremely specific to gunshot residue. They're referred to as characteristic GSR or characteristic gunshot residue particles. You may also get some 1 and 2 component particles as well. Those are particles that contain just one of those 3 elements or 2 of those 3 elements. So just lead or barium or antimony, or lead and antimony, lead and barium, or barium and antimony. Those are 1 and 2 component particles. Those particles are then going to land on the hands, the clothing, and the surrounding area of the shooter.
Let me ask you, if you have a 1-component particle or a 2-component particle, is that gunshot residue?
Basically, the most I can say about 1 and 2 component particles is that they could be gunshot residue. They're particles that could come from the discharge of a firearm, but they could come from other sources as well. You really need those particles that have all 3 of those elements condensed together in 1 particle in order to say that it's very specific to the discharge of a firearm.
Is there a reason that science requires all 3 to be present?
Just because it is very specific to gunshot residue. There are very few other sources in which those 3 components can be found condensed together in 1 particle.
But one or both of those particles exist in the environment all around us, correct?
The particles that contain only 1 element or 2 elements can be contained in other sources.
So in order to ensure that you don't have a false positive or contamination, your science and forensics requires all 3 to be present in order for gunshot residue to be your conclusive answer.
That's correct. It's also very important that the particles have the correct shape or the correct morphology. You want them to look rounded or molten or smooth as if they came from the result of a high temperature burn.
Tell us how it is that GSR, gunshot residue, is deposited on the skin as this plume is blown out of the gun.
As that bullet goes forward and out of the firearm, the primer particulate, the lead, the antimony, and the barium, it's going to form, it looks like a cloud of smoke around that firearm. Then as the temperature cools and those elements start to condense out together, they're simply going to land on the hands, the clothing, and the surrounding area of the shooter.
How is it that those samples are collected for evidentiary testing after the gun has been fired?
Samples for gunshot residue are collected using the standard in the field, which is referred to as a stub. Basically the stub is for scanning electron microscopy. So they're referred to as scanning electron microscopy stubs or SEM stubs. Now what they look like, it's about the size of a dime, okay? It's an aluminum pin mount about the size of a dime. And on the surface of that pin mount, it's like a really heavy duty double stick tape. It's a very adhesive material. That pin mount is then put into a plastic base, and it has a plastic vial lid that goes over top of it. So when you're collecting samples for gunshot residue, you're simply going to take the vial lid off the top. In a very technical term, you're going to dab back and forth the area of interest. So you're going to dab back and forth, and then you're going to dab up and down, creating a grid-like pattern to ensure that you're covering the entire area of interest.
And the purpose is to cover the entire area. You're not looking for a discrete sample in any one particular location.
That's correct. The area of interest, whether it be hands or clothing or another item or object.
And there are 2 that are commonly used, one for the left hand, one for the right hand.
Yes, sir. In a hand kit. Yes, sir.
Did you receive 2, one for left, one for right? Is it related to Brian Lever?
Yes, sir, I did.
After you received the item, tell us what you do to examine it.
Whenever we receive this particular item and any evidentiary items in our laboratory, the very first thing that's done is a chain of custody is started, which basically is a piece of paper that is going to tell us everywhere that the samples have been, who has touched it, when they touched it, how they touched them. When the evidence is opened, everything is photographed, everything is documented, from the way it was received to how it was opened to how it was packaged. The analyst who is examining the evidence, in this case it was myself, I am in our evidence room. I would be wearing a laboratory coat. I would be wearing latex gloves and any other necessary personal protective equipment. As I said, the evidence was then opened, photographed, documented as to its contents.
After it's open, photographed, documented, what do you do?
The next thing we'll do is analyze the samples, and we analyze them using the instrument called the Scanning Electron Microscope, or the SEM.
And because I got right on into your testimony, what training, education, experience, and qualifications do you have to hold this position to do this testing?
I do have my bachelor's of arts in biochemistry, and I also have my master's in forensic science and law. There were several courses at school, which was Duquesne University, that helped me prepare to use that instrument. And I also went through RJ Lee Group's intensive training program in order to be able to be proficient using that instrument and in analyzing gunshot residue.
How long have you worked for RG Lee Group?
I've actually worked for RJ Lee Group since 2002, immediately after I graduated from high school. And I worked there all through college, part-time, and then was accepted as a full-time member in 2007, in May of 2007.
And during the course of your career at RJ Lee Group, how many of these types of tests have you performed?
How many of these tests,
Yes.
gunshot residue tests?
Ballpark.
RJ Lee Group receives approximately 200 cases a year, and the number of samples can range anywhere from 1 to 40 or 50. So I would say in my time there, I've probably worked on about 700 cases, and have analyzed 5,000 to 6,000 samples of potential gunshot residue.
And have you been called around the courts of the United States and also the world to testify as an expert in this field?
Yes, sir, I have.
Tell us about the analysis that was conducted with respect to these particular swabs, what your findings were.
Just to clarify, to make it completely clear, they are stubs.
Stubs, excuse me.
That's okay. They're not swabs. It's not like a Q-tip. So we're talking about those pin mounts that have that adhesive material on the top of them. The instrument, as I mentioned, that is used is called the SEM. And this is not a typical microscope like you would imagine using in high school, where you would look down lens tubes at a small specimen. This is a microscope that has a chamber, and samples are loaded into that chamber, and then I'm able to see the samples on a computer monitor. So imagine you have a camcorder or a video recorder, okay? And let's say your video recorder is plugged into your television set, and as you're videotaping, you're able to see what you're videotaping on your television screen live time. That's exactly how a scanning electron microscope is going to work, only I'm able to see what I'm looking at a magnification of about 5,000. So I'm able to see these very, very small particles on the computer monitor.
As you looked at the stubs for the left and right hands of Mr. Leverett, what is it that you found specifically?
May I refer to my report?
Please.
As I mentioned, there were two stubs that we received at RJ Lee Group. One was labeled Leverett right hand, one was labeled Leverett left hand. On the right hand, there were no characteristic gunshot residue particles.
Let me stop you right there. There were 0 particles of gunshot residue that contained all 3 elements.
That's correct. There were 0 3-component particles or characteristic particles. There were 3 2-component particles, so particles that contain 2 of the 3 elements.
And that's not gunshot residue, right?
Those are particles that the most we could say about them is that they could be gunshot residue. And there were also some 1-component particles confirmed as well.
And again, not gunshot residue.
Again, the most we could say is that they could be from the discharge of a firearm, but they could be from other sources as well. On the left hand, there were no particles, there were no characteristic gunshot residue particles, and there were no 2-component particles.
So again, 0 3-component particles means 0 gunshot residue.
That's correct.
Then you have 0 combinations of 2 of those components.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
There were some one-component particles confirmed.
And so what you can tell us conclusively about the hands of Brian Leopard is that we have no gunshot residue.
We have no 3-component characteristic particles that I can say definitely came from the discharge of a firearm. What we have are we have 3 2-component particles and some 1-component particles that could have come from the discharge of a firearm or could have come from other sources.
When we're looking at gunshot residue, what is it that gunshot residue is really measuring? Is it determining whether or not a person fired a gun?
No, sir. Basically, when gunshot residue is found, there are 3 possible reasons why that gunshot residue could be there. Those reasons are, number 1, this person discharged a firearm. Number 2, this person was in close proximity when a firearm was discharged. Or number 3, this person came into contact with something that had gunshot residue on it, something like a discharged firearm.
And since we had 0 particles of gunshot residue, we can say that none of those conditions were met.
We can't say that definitively. We can say that there are no 3-component particles present.
What would you expect to find if a person had, in fact, discharged a firearm? What would you expect to find in analyzing those stones?
There's a wide range of possibilities that can be found. To give a hypothetical situation, if I were to discharge a firearm in a static environment, which means an environment where there's no wind or no airflow, no precipitation, no rain or snow, if my firearm is a good depositor of particles and my ammunition is a good depositor of particles, if I were to discharge that firearm and then collect samples from my hands right after I discharge that firearm, I would expect to find hundreds to thousands of characteristic gunshot residue particles.
And the same thing with 1 component particles and 2 component particles.
Yes, I would expect to find a population of particles, which would include the 1-component, 2-component, and characteristic particles.
And in fact, you didn't find anything like that in this situation.
No, sir.
Does it matter, or do you consider the properties and physical characteristics of the weapon that may have been fired?
Yes, there are physical properties of the firearm that could play a role.
I'll show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 19. There's a latex gloves there. Take out the gloves, handle the gun if you'd like. Show us the places where gunshot residue could have leaked out of this gun and gotten all over the hands of Brian Leopard.
Just in general, any opening or available opening in the firearm is a possible escape route for these particles. So anywhere where there would be a potential opening could be a place for that primer residue to escape. Any opening that you see in the firearm, for example, right here, the end of the firearm itself, and then any crack or crevice back down through here, along this side, any opening in the firearm is a possible escape route for primer residue.
And if an individual has that gun shouldered against his right shoulder and his right hand on the trigger there, those holes that you've just demonstrated to us are very near where his right hand would have been in order to pull that trigger.
I would assume so if he's holding it as you described.
Put the weapon back. Sorry. And I just want to be sure that we've got your testimony right. There are a lot of environmental factors to consider when you're looking at the analysis and whether or not a person has gunshot residue on their hands, right?
Yes, sir.
But given the firearm that you've just examined and your experience in this field, had someone fired that gun, you would expect more gunshot residue particles than what you found.
It really is dependent upon the entire nature of the incident. If I were to have discharged that firearm in the condition that I described in the hypothetical situation, in a static environment, not a lot of wind flow, not a lot of airflow, and then sampled my hands immediately after that discharge or soon after that discharge, I would expect to find 3-component gunshot residue particles.
Let me ask you just real quickly, because you said immediately after. Is it important to note in this case that that Mr. Leverett's hands were bagged immediately upon his death? That he didn't use his hands, he didn't wash his hands, there weren't any external forces acting upon his hands?
That is something important to note because one of the biggest factors of particulate loss is movement or motion or activity. So for example, if I have hundreds of gunshot residue particles on my hands and then I wash my hands, I could eliminate all of those particles on my hands. If I were to put my hands in my pockets, if I were to run my hands through my hair, any movement or motion or activity could contribute to particulate loss. So bagging the hands is going to help maintain whatever is present on those hands.
Just to be clear, last question. There was no conclusive finding of the 3-particle gunshot residue on either of these stubs.
That's correct. There were no 3-component characteristic gunshot residue particles found on either sample.
Okay, thank you much.
Cross-examination by counsel for Greenlaw.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Ms. Murtha, RJB Group, where do you get your work from?
We get our work mainly from police agencies and crime labs over the United States and a lot of the Caribbean islands.
And what information do you know about this case before you started analyzing the 2 stubs?
About this case particularly,
Yes.
I did not know any information about this case with the exception of what was on the information sheet that was sent to us.
And what is on the information sheet that you received?
If I could refer to
Yes.
that sheet. The sheet that was sent to us lists the subject's full name as Leverett, Brian, his date of birth, and it also says the date that the shooting took place and the approximate time. There's a little more information than that, but
So basically biographical information.
yes, sir.
And we know it's a shooting.
Yes, sir.
Now, you created a 3-page report based on your analysis of the 2 stubs.
Yes, sir.
So what we know conclusively is that there was no 3-component particle on either hand,
That on the samples, yes, sir.
or on the 2 stubs.
Yes, sir.
But we also know conclusively that there were 3 items of 2-component particles on Mr. Leverett's right hand,
Yes,
or
sir.
the stub for Mr. Leverett's right hand.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
So that means that there was a combination of 2 of the following 3, lead, barium, and antimony.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Also, on page 3 of your report, I guess the second paragraph, it's a 1-sentence paragraph, and it states that the absence of GSR does not eliminate the possibility that the subject handled or discharged a firearm.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
That's a correct statement?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Cross-examination by counsel for Ray Greenlaw.
We have no additional questions.
Redirect.
Just real quickly, these 2-component particles that you talked about,
Yes, sir.
could they have come from picking up a gun that had been previously fired at some time in the past?
Yes, sir, it's possible.
Thanks. Nothing further, Judge.
May we release Ms. Murphy from her subpoena?
No objection.
All right, you are released from your subpoena this time. Thank you.
step up to the podium, please. Raise your right hand to be sworn in. Answer out loud.
You solemnly swear affirm the testimony you should give this crossing the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes, ma'am, I do.
Witness is seated.
Please the court. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Can you tell us your name?
Joshua Mott.
And what do you do for a living?
I'm a crime scene investigator with the Volusia County Sheriff's Office
How long have you been so employed?
for the past 11 years.
And kind of brief for us some of the duties of a crime scene investigator for the Volusia County Sheriff's Office.
We're responsible for the documentation, collection, and preservation of physical evidence.
Do you work with Dave DeWeese?
Yes, sir, I do.
Were you involved in the case involving the death of Brian Leverett from October 29, 2011?
Yes, sir.
You weren't initially involved in the scene response in a material fashion, were you?
That's correct.
You were only involved in the autopsy.
That's correct.
Tell us what it is that a crime scene investigator is, or why it is that a crime scene investigator is required to attend the autopsy.
We're there to collect some evidence, collect evidence that is recovered by the medical examiner during their procedure. We're also there to act as a liaison with the Sheriff's Office to exchange information between the offices as it's learned.
To keep the medical examiner informed,
Absolutely.
to receive information back from the medical examiner,
Yes, sir.
to take photographs,
Yes, sir.
to collect anything that the medical examiner may find during the course of his investigation,
Exactly.
and to collect anything that may be recovered on the body or in the body during the course of the autopsy.
Yes, sir.
Did you attend the autopsy of Brian Leverett?
Yes, sir.
And did you do that on October 31st of 2011?
Yes, sir.
Was that autopsy conducted at the Volusia County Medical Examiner's Office by Dr. Tim Gallagher?
Yes, it was.
And during the course of your time there, did you collect particular items of evidence during the autopsy?
Yes, sir, I did.
Approach and show you several items real quick. Showing you what's been marked PP for identification purposes. You recognize that item?
Yes, sir, I do.
And before we talk about the items exclusively, tell us a little bit about how it is that a body comes to the medical examiner's office here in Volusia County.
The medical examiner, that is, has a team of investigators that responds to scenes to aid and investigate side by side with us. They collect their certain facts there at the scene, and then they either will use the investigator themselves or a contracted delivery service to transport the body. They'll respond to the scene, they will package the body in a body bag, they will seal it up, they will put a number of unique seal on the body, and they will transport it to their office.
And was that done in this particular case?
Yes, sir, it was.
And you know that because you were there when the body bag was opened and the seals were broken.
Exactly.
As we're talking about item PP there in front of you, what is in that container?
PP is a paper bag that contains bags which were used to package the deceased hands.
And why is it important to package the hands of the deceased in a case such as this?
Well, it's preserving a couple different things. One potentially being gunshot residue or DNA evidence. Anytime there's someone that's killed, we want to preserve any evidence that may have been exchanged from them to the person who killed them or anything like that.
And
Blood.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say blood as well, things like that. We want to preserve it.
When the bag is open, the body is still dressed as it was at the scene.
Yes, sir.
at some point the clothes are removed, the bags are removed. Why is it that law enforcement collects the bags from the cans?
In case there's been any transfer of any trace evidence to these bags.
And in this particular case, you collected the bags from Brian Levert's hands.
Yes, sir.
Did you do anything after you removed the bags from Brian Levert's hands?
Took photographs of them.
Did you do any examination or collect any samples from his hands?
A gunshot residue collection was made by the medical examiner's office, and then I took possession of that kit.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit LL. Do you recognize that item?
It's the item I just mentioned, the gunshot residue kit collected at autopsy by the medical examiner staff from Mr. Leverett.
And we just finished hearing about how a stub is taken across the hand and dabbed across the hand in order to collect whatever evidence may be on the hands of this gunshot residue. Was that done in this particular case?
Yes, sir.
And was it done in your presence?
Yes, sir.
And that is in fact the kit that was used to collect the potential gunshot residue from Mr. Leverett.
Yes, sir. This is a package I created, and it's sealed with evidence tape that I fixed with my initials, my ID number, and the date that I sealed it.
After it was packaged and sealed by you, it was sent off to RJB Group, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and eventually returned back to your agency and here in court today.
Yes, sir.
Placed before you items MM and NM. Do you recognize those two items?
They are both packages I created, which contain projectiles recovered by the medical examiner staff during their autopsy from Mr. Leverett.
Were you present during the time in which they were collected from the body?
Yes, sir.
And were you the person who packaged them in those containers?
Yes, sir.
After you packaged them in those containers, did they go off to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for additional testing?
Yes, they did.
And they returned to your agency at some point in time and are present here in court today?
Yes, sir.
Judge, if there are no objections, state would move LL, excuse me, LL, MM, NN, and PP into evidence as state's against.
Any objection?
No objection on behalf of Wayne Greenlaw. No. No objection.
LL will be admitted as State's Exhibit 34. M has 35. Sorry, MM has 35, NN has 36, and PP is 37.
And you mentioned to us that in addition to collecting evidence, physical evidence, that your function is also to take photographs of items of interest in the autopsy. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, certainly.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit G and H. Do you recognize these series of photographs?
Yes, sir, I do.
What do you recognize them to be?
I recognize them as photos taken of the medical examiner's office during this autopsy we're talking about.
Photographs that you took
Yes, sir.
fairly accurately depict the autopsy as it was seen by you then.
Yes, sir.
Judge, if there are no objections, state move G and H into evidence as states against.
We have a Ray Greenlaw.
No objection.
We have a Ray Greenlaw.
No objection.
All right, G will be admitted as State's Exhibit 38, and H will be admitted as State's Exhibit 39.
I have just one of those.
examination on behalf of Wayne Greenlaw.
Good afternoon.
Loser.
Investigator Mott, when did you arrive at the Volusia County Medical Examiner's office on October 31st, 2011?
I'm not sure of the exact time.
Do you know what time the body was, or Mr. Levertt's body was picked up from Aspen Street and transported to the medical examiner's office?
I was not part of that, no, sir.
Do you recall if you arrived during daylight hours or during nighttime hours?
Certainly daylight hours.
Late afternoon?
I would suspect it was probably the morning.
Do you know what time this incident occurred?
No, sir, I do not.
When you arrived at the medical examiner's office, were Mr. Levertt's hands already bagged?
Yes, sir.
Do you know what time his hands were actually bagged?
No, sir, I do not.
Were you a witness to the unbagging of his hands?
Yes, sir.
Do you know what time that occurred?
No, sir.
After his hands were unbagged, did you then witness the administration of the gunshot residue exam?
Yes, sir.
Were his hands then rebagged after that or not?
No.
While you're at the medical examiner's office, you took photographs
Yes, sir.
for evidence in this case,
Yes, sir.
and you collected evidence from Mr. Leverett.
No, it was collected by the medical examiner. They turned it over to
And
me.
they turned it over to you.
Yes, sir.
And did you ever go at any time to Aspen Street at all?
No, sir.
Cross-examination on behalf of Wayne Greenlaw.
Just one question, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Investigator Mott.
Hello, sir.
When you witnessed the gunshot residue test collection of Mr. Leverett, was the individuals were, or the hands were in a paper bag, I would assume?
Yes, sir.
Was that bag also dabbed for gunshot residue, or was it just the hands?
No, just the hands.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Redirect, Mr. Wells.
Go ahead.
And we release Investigator Mott from his subpoena.
Yes, ma'am.
The objection?
No objection.
On behalf of Ray Greenlaw, any objection?
No objection.
Investigator Mott, you are released from your subpoena, however, I need to inform you of your duties under the rule of sequestration. You're not to discuss your testimony here today with any other witness or anyone else for that matter. And should you violate that instruction, the court could take court proceedings regarding that violation. Do you have any questions about that instruction?
No, ma'am, thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the state has no other witnesses available this afternoon, so we will have to continue tomorrow morning. That would have been the case if we had or had not had the interruption earlier. So there's not always an ability to estimate how long a witness is going to take. So I don't know if I should give you an apology or not for letting go at 4:30. You may appreciate it, but as I indicated to you earlier, these attorneys have been told to plan on and try to go through 6 o'clock so that we can push this case through and have it finished as quickly as possible. But there are times when we go over, and there's times when it's not, it doesn't take up the full time. So this is one of those afternoons, you get to go home now, subject to all the prior court instructions. We will see you back, ready to begin at 8:45 tomorrow morning. questions asked, but are there any additional matters we can address this evening as well?
There are instructions if you want to go there.
Have council even had an opportunity to look at it?
I have not, Judge. I mean, I had before the trial started, but not.
Can we talk about a potential schedule from here forward so we can figure out where we can look at jury instructions? What? All right, so Mr. Forbes' testimony is going to take approximately,
He's probably got 30 minutes of questions to answer at most. And then roughly 4 hours of interviews. And then no additional questions from the state.
well, we're going to start with the medical examiner or investigator for it?
No, investigator Ford, the medical examiner will be last. Medical examiner would likely take maybe 30 minutes, maybe direct 40 minutes.
So we're not going to get done with investigator Ford in the morning, well, with him and the interview. So that'll roll over into the early afternoon,
Yes, ma'am.
probably to the mid-afternoon with the medical examiner.
Entirely likely.
So that leaves, depending on what time you want to end, 2 to 3 hours for defense tomorrow. What is, to the extent that you know it, your anticipated schedule?
Well, first of all, I would tell you that I think it may take a little bit longer with investigator Ford and perhaps,
So you think all day for investigator Ford, the interviews, and the medical examiner?
I think so.
Okay. And could you have a witness on standby to be called early afternoon to potentially report in the afternoon?
Certainly could. And Judge, I'm thinking out loud, and I was just gonna start to look at it whenever you said that was the schedule. Mary Cassell is somebody that we should be able to get in. We've got Bob Ryan here, the investigator. Our expert is flying in, will be in tonight, so he will be available tomorrow, so we will definitely have somebody that will be available.
Well, Mr. Will needs an opportunity to,
Given it to him already.
okay, so your conversation on the phone the other day satisfied your request to talk to him or depose him before his testimony?
Yes, ma'am. I had a conversation with him. He's a lawyer on the commission. That's ethically bound to all the discussion we had.
So I'm not asking you to commit to the specific witnesses, but as long as there's a witness or two, it sounds like there would either be here in the courthouse or available.
We'll have them available.
And then whether you start tomorrow afternoon or not, how long do you anticipate your case on behalf of Wayne Greenlaw will take?
Given that we've already called everybody else, I think America Cell is going to be very short. I would say 30 minutes. It's going to be in reference to a 911 call. The expert will probably take combined maybe between the two of us 45 minutes to an hour. Between the three of us, I mean. We are going to call the mother, the Leverage, the Greenlaw's mom, Ms. Daniel. And that'll be very short, 30 minutes.